Hey folks, welcome to Tome Travelers. This is a show where we travel through RPG tomes of the past. Tonight we are traveling to the year 2257, somewhere in the neutral territory of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, to a diplomatic space station known as Babylon 5. On our small planet, at this moment, here we face a critical branch point in history. What we do with our planet right now will propagate down through the centuries and powerfully affect the destiny of our descendants. It is well within our power to destroy our civilization and, perhaps, our species as well. If we capitulate to superstition, greed, or stupidity, we can plunge our world into a darkness deeper than the time between the collapse of classical civilization and the Italian Renaissance. But we are also capable of using our compassion and our intelligence, our technology and our wealth to create an abundant and meaningful life for every inhabitant of this planet, to enhance enormously our understanding of the universe and to carry us to the stars. Carl Sagan, Cosmos. Hey folks, and welcome to Tome Travelers. That quote was from the opening pages of the role-playing book that we're going to be talking about tonight.
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and discuss the Babylon 5 role-playing game, and as it's called on here, Factbook. It's put out by Mongoose Publishing. So we're kind of starting off this series. We're just going to dip our toe a little bit into some of the books that aren't around anymore, aren't in production. For those of you who don't know what Babylon 5 was, I guess we ought to start off there. So Babylon 5 was a sci-fi series. It was from the late 90s.
It was 93 to 98. It was the early 90s. Right. Babylon 5 was a TV show that I was only peripherally aware of as I was quite young, but my dad watched quite a bit. But it was about a space station, and kind of, if you guys have ever played the Mass Effect games, Babylon 5 is reminiscent to me of the Citadel. Where there is ambassadors and representatives from the core races that have come together, and it's a diplomatic kind of place. I mean, they do have Earth Force there, and they do have military presence, but it seems definitely a lot more diplomatic in nature.
Yeah, it is a space opera per se, but it deals a little bit less with ships traveling everywhere and more with a central location where all these races are coming together to try and hash out their disagreements. And the political structure of it is kind of interesting because you've got so many bodies that each one of them don't agree necessarily with any of the others. Every society seems to have its own set standard of morals, and it makes for, in my opinion, a really interesting TV show. So.
My dad loved it. I was much more fond of Star Trek and Deep Space Nine. As John has heard me say many times, and my dad could tell you, I really didn't know anything about Babylon 5 except for the character named Garibaldi, who I referred to mostly as Going Baldy rather than his name. And it irritated my dad because it was very disrespectful. And that actor has since passed on, and it's sad because I've gone back and watched the show, and it was a lot better than I gave it credit for when I was 10.
Yeah. And Jerry Doyle, who played the character, was a wonderful man, in my opinion. A lot of his commentary on society and other things, I really enjoyed it. And the show had other people on there. Two people I like to joke kind of missed their calling, Bruce Boxleitner and Claudia Christian. With the alliteration, I feel like they probably should have been superheroes rather than actors. You also had several people who appeared in various sci-fi series. Historically, you had the boy who was in Lost in Space. You had
Billy Mooney.
You had various actors who, you had an actor who had come from Demolition Man. And so he had been in that. Just all these luminaries, and it was an amazing show, in my opinion. Now, it's definitely dated. You can't help but watch it and kind of wince a little bit at the CG work, but it is still, in my opinion, a great show. And obviously, it must have been, I must not be the only person who feels that way because it got turned into an RPG.
Well, I was reading the opening here in the game, found it very interesting because the writer of the show, J. Michael Straczynski, writes an introduction to the role-playing game book, which he had only ever played a role-playing game one time, in his life, and he actually, it looks like, without naming it, because this is not by the same company, it looks like it was a Call of Cthulhu game that he played 2 years before Babylon 5 even began, but he mentions that the game came out 10 years after the premiere of the show. So, but he says after that game, his quote was, "I figured that this pretty much ended my dalliance with the world of role-playing gaming. Turns out I was both technically right and profoundly, utterly wrong at the same time." He goes on to essentially say that his time writing for Babylon 5 was, in essence, to him, a 5-year, 10-year even afterwards, when he was continuing to try to do things for the content, role play for him, getting into the minds of the characters. So it's very interesting, but I don't know anything about J. Michael Straczynski, but reading this brief introduction to this book, he's got a great sense of humor and a great way with words and a very approachable writing style. So J. Michael Straczynski was the writer, but pretty much was the producer of the Babylon 5 series. And as he notes, this game came out roughly about 10 years, almost exactly after the 2003,
premiere.
And it premiered. The show premiered in 1993.
The show ran for 5 years, from 93 to 98. 2003, the book comes out, and giving it a little bit of dating as far as time period when it came out, we have the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated that year. You have 11 million people protesting the war in Iraq worldwide. That year was also the year that the Human Genome Project announced that it was 99% complete. Going on with the game, 10 years after it ended in the US, it's one of those things where it was still showing overseas. Showing in Britain, I believe up until 2013. And Mongoose Publishing, the company that put it out, is in Great Britain. So it still had a core audience there. It had, something to keep it in the limelight, keeping it fresh and keeping it out there. That's, one of those things where when it came out here in the US, it had been just a little bit of time. And I was a huge fan of the show. I've always loved Babylon 5. But I was like, this kind of is a little bit odd, isn't it? I mean, it hasn't been around in a while. Reason it hadn't come out here in the US, as far as, reruns and whatnot, had to do with Warner Brother contract issues and showing.
It says here, why isn't Babylon 5 available in reruns? Short answer, because due to corporate infighting at Warner Brothers, they simply don't make it available. So it is a lot more difficult to find. Some online streaming services seem to offer it potentially, and you can get it on, services like Vudu. You can buy DVDs, things like that, etc. But
as far as shows that people nowadays may know him from, if you've been following series on Netflix called Sense8, that is his most recent show that he's been showing. He's been trying, so 2013 was the final year Babylon 5 being shown overseas, and he announced in 2014 that he was going to try and bring it back, and he's been trying to collect funds for it and everything else, and has this dream of continuing it, but it just hasn't really happened yet. I'm hopeful. I think it would be great. All things considered, Mongoose did a great job of continuing with the books. First edition came out in 2003 based on the D20 license.
He wrote Thor.
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
And World War Z. I mean, he wrote these with people, but
he was involved in those.
He was involved in these projects. He actually wrote Changeling, which I believe was an Angelina Jolie movie.
Oh, definitely some big name stuff.
Some big name stuff. Not a whole lot for TV since Babylon 5.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, this game was put out with the D20 system license and developed in 2001. The idea of this license was essentially Wizards of the Coast, who had published Dungeons & Dragons and is still publishing Dungeons & Dragons. For their third edition property, they decided to make a universal gaming system out of the mechanics. And so the D20 system license was created, and the opportunity was put out for other publishers to come along and use their core mechanic to make their own games.
Mm-hmm. It even has in the front of the Babylon 5 book, it recommends a copy of the Player's Handbook 3rd edition from Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it capitalizes on the concept and mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, where you have race, class, skills, feats, leveling. It's really interesting because that allows them to bring along players who are already familiar with the system. So if you have players of role-playing games who are familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, by kind of aligning your game with that system, you can then try to have a core market that you're already aiming at. They're role players and they already know the system. Well, here's a new game that fits within that system. I mean, there are several companies that do this general mechanics system out there. You have Savage Worlds now has one. Say, for instance, the Age system.
Yeah.
Let's see. So you have Powered by the Apocalypse, which is the system that works for the Masks RPG.
Oh.
I know that Third Eye Games has a proprietary system that just opened up to try and see if other companies want to apply for licenses.
Sorry, I was looking up some of the actors and actresses because looking at the D20 book for Babylon 5, I'm seeing faces and I'm remembering them from other TV shows and movies. So I was just looking up.
There are tons of people.
The French woman from Lost is the Minbari ambassador or counselor or whatever, and then Stephen Dorn, I believe is his name.
Yes.
From which I only know him as Flounder from Animal House. But
well, he wasn't Narn. He was with.
Centauri. He wasn't. Yeah. He wasn't Narn. I'm sorry.
And he's actually the actor that was eventually in Demolition Man. Although I think he might have also been in Total Recall. But so during that time period, he was in a couple different sci-fi movies.
Okay. Sorry.
Oh no, it's great because then my brain immediately shifts. So yeah, and you got of course Walter Koenig from Star Trek also makes an appearance in the series.
See, yeah, I don't. Kind of a jerk though, isn't he?
Oh yeah.
Isn't he kind of a like?
Oh yeah.
It's kind of the space station's equivalent of a cop show's internal affairs.
Yes.
Internal crimes officer.
To some extent, he's almost a villain. The way his character comes off a couple of times in the series.
And he was Chekhov?
Yes.
In Star Trek, yes.
Mm-hmm. But so, back to the different games out there, the different licenses, D20 games. I think that a lot of what people do when they try and make universal systems, a study of the D20 license is almost necessary. Because that was like an earlier gaming renaissance. I really feel like we're in a gaming renaissance now where tabletop games and role-playing games are coming back into the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when 3rd edition D&D came out and all these other games hit, it was another earlier renaissance for role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
And so this D20 license, it's universal. And you, as a publisher, have a certain point that you have to make. And that is, with a universal license, such as, say, the D20 Modern book or the D20 Ultra Modern or D20 Space, all these books that came out, it really was one of those things where you have to put out a game that is worthwhile and contains enough material that the gamers will purchase it. Because quite often, a gamer has impasse. I've been in games where we wanted to play Star Wars, but we didn't have the books. Because at that time, the Star Wars games weren't currently out. The West End Games D6 version of it had been out of print for quite a while, so we just used the D20 Ultramodern book and the Future book to play our own game. Mm-hmm. And it was on the storyteller to create all the mechanics. So you have to, if you're going to put out a game with a universal system, you have to provide enough material that it is unique and they can justify spending the money on it in order to get your system. It's got to be low enough in cost, but at the same time contain enough that people want it. And I think this is an excellent example of that done right, because it is full color, beautiful illustrations, as well as pictures from the show that really captures people's attention. It's well written, well laid out.
It looks like it's even got character stats for all the characters on the show.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like this is a game that warrants the purchase of it. If you can find it, yeah. If you are trying to play a game version of Babylon 5, this is a great way to go. And all the work is done for you, all the crunch is done for you, and it is really well done. So this is a time period when a lot of people were trying to hop on that D20 license. Let's see, Seven Seas putting out Swashbuckling Adventures. You had Big Eyes Small Mouth put out a D20 version of their game. Mm-hmm. Call of Cthulhu actually hired Monty Cook, who is really big in the roleplay world now.
Yeah, for Numenera is his big title right now.
And Monty Cook actually was hired and brought on to do a D20 version of Call of Cthulhu, following the exact same concept of classes and leveling with skills and feats. You had L5R at the same time began putting out books that had both stats for their old system, which was the D20 pool system, and the D20 system all compiled together within one book. And eventually Star Wars even put out their own D20 version. So, I think that the market just was saturated with D20. Eventually...
It's still... in my opinion, it still is the most common.
Yeah. And I think to some extent...
With games like Pathfinder, I know that those are all kind of proprietary licenses now, where they're not necessarily OGL any longer. But with Pathfinder and D&D 5th edition, these are all still D20-based systems.
Yeah. But I feel like the market, the bottom just fell out at a certain point. It was partially 4th edition of D&D coming along and them revoking a lot of licenses, or at least licenses to keep up with 4th edition. The market just kind of stalled out there for a while. And now we've got so many new systems that have come along, and I think they're finding their own popularity. You have Modifius with the system that they're using now for Star Trek,
which is 2D20.
Mm-hmm. You have obviously the Age system, which Dragon
3D6.
Age, Dragon Age got big awards this last year. We've got, who else do we got out there? We've, of course, White Wolf is still around doing their storyteller system.
Mm-hmm. Which is very popular.
Mm-hmm.
Other D10 systems, a lot of games are using D10.
Yeah.
7th Sea.
Yeah, the newest edition of 7th Sea.
Ninja Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of games are using a D10-based system. They're all just slightly different, but it seems like they don't see the need for using a D20 when 10s seem to be enough. So do you think that could have been part of the reason why Mongoose decided to abandon the Babylon 5 content or the system, because they were... I don't know. I know their other big title is Traveler.
It is.
Is Traveler a D20 system?
Traveler is, I believe, a 3D6 system.
Okay. Then, would that may have led to that decision to move on from... Because this didn't have its own system. This was all based off the D20, and maybe they felt... I don't know. Do you think they felt maybe the market for a D20 game, they wanted to focus on their own proprietary systems?
I actually do. I think a lot of companies... kind of made that jump because, like, for instance, we'll come to them eventually, but Crafty Games and what was Fantasy Craft, they made their own game system, kind of leaving behind the, D&D. They wanted to do their own thing and take control of their own product. Several companies around that time, they completely abandoned role-playing games. And it might have been a smart move for some of them. Like AEG has become a superpower in tabletop games as far as board games go when they abandoned all their role-playing game licenses.
Right.
Maybe that's it. And quite honestly, it was smart. The companies that are still around did that.
Right. Yeah, as far as, in flipping through this book, they give stuff that you need to get started, and they give kind of a brief overview of role-playing games and playing in your first role-playing game, and then playing in they have a great history for the casual viewer of Babylon 5. You kind of get a page and a half of crunch history leading up to the construction and Babylon 5 and the events of the television show. But they even tell you where to read in the player's handbook, the D&D 3rd edition player's handbook, how much of that you actually need to play. And then they have all their specialized races, just as any other RPG core book would give you. You have your races and your classes and your stats. It looks very nice. They've got advancement tables. It reads like a D20
absolutely.
D20 rules book. So if you're already familiar with D20 and any of the number of systems that we've talked about, coming to Babylon 5, and if you have an interest in Babylon 5 or space, sci-fi, anything, whether or not you watch the show, I've gone back in the last year and watched the first season, and we're actually going to go back and redo that for another project that we have upcoming that we hope to tell you guys about soon. If you have any interest in things like Star Trek, as I said before, Mass Effect, which is my all-time favorite sci-fi franchise, I will suffer rebukes of many for that, but it is my favorite, and I love it, and I've played it many, many times.
It is. And I actually take it as... although I'm not at all involved in the creation of Babylon 5, that you took a moment and actually said that Babylon 5 in some minute way reminded you of Mass Effect. I kind of take that as a compliment.
No, it does. It reminds me of certain parts of the Mass Effect universe. In fact, some of the races remind me of races on, you can look at most sci-fi television shows that take place in space on ships and usually find a lot of correlation. Mass Effect obviously is kind of someone else's homage to sci-fi of the past, but Babylon 5, there is a lot of similarities between Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine, the space station in the Star Trek universe. That if anybody watched that show, that was another one that my dad watched a lot. We watched a lot of sci-fi in my house as a kid. My mom hated every second of it, but I thought it was great. But yeah, the Citadel in Mass Effect is very much Babylon 5 to me.
Yeah. With Babylon 5, it ran its course as far as a property goes on TV. They actually did 2 follow-up series, I believe. They did a story about the Rangers, and then they did another story that was not named for Babylon 5 at all, which actually had to do with almost this biblical mission to go out and find a way to cure the Earth after it gets attacked by a genetic,
spoilers
attack. So, oh no. It's one of those things where that show has been around for a while, and actually a lot of people who watched the second show, because they changed the design and the way the show was done, they had no idea it had anything to do with Babylon 5.
Do you remember the name of it? Did you say it?
I did not. It's kind of sad. They only ran it for like about 3 to 5 episodes, and then they shut it down.
I'm going to look it up.
And so
Babylon 5 spin-off. Crusade,
that's it. Yeah, so
had 13 episodes.
Yeah, definitely good to call it biblical then. So.
Yeah, it takes place 5 years after the events of Babylon 5 and just after the movie A Call to Arms. That was one thing that I don't think we have mentioned. What network was Babylon 5 on originally? Part of its prime time, it's a WB.
Well, yeah, it's a WB. I mean, if WB owned the license, I would think it would be a channel associated with it then.
PTEN had it, which I don't remember that as a television station, but it was then also on TNT in 98, so maybe that's what TNT became, or what became TNT.
It's possible. I just remember, when I was a kid in Plano, that's when the show came on originally. As far as just watching that show, we had very few channels. We were still using antennas. We didn't have cable. I just remember tuning in, and we had, I think at our house, we had like 5 channels. I don't remember which one it was.
Okay, P10 essentially became the WB or UPN.
Okay, there we go.
So I probably knew it as UPN because I remember that station before it became the WB.
All right.
But we're talking a long time ago when I knew a lot more television stations than I know now, because we don't watch any live television. We watch all streaming now. So
yeah, the television show ended, the game ended. They ended their license of it in 2009. Matthew Sprange from Mongoose Publishing said, "We have had a great ride on the Babylon 5 station for the past 6 years, visiting the Minbari homeworld and traveling to the Rim, but all good things must come to an end." So the RPG was shut down. Some point before that time, they also had a miniatures battle game, very similar to the Star Wars X-Wing game, and they had shut that down. And they took the remainder of the material at that time, which was about 3 or 4 different guides and some books, even a book by Claudia Christian, and put it all together to make one final book called Deconstruction of Falling Stars. That was the end of the Babylon 5 game as we have seen it. Now, do I think that this game is ever going to come back? I really don't think so. And if it does, it'll probably be covered under a different mechanic at this point.
Yeah, I highly doubt that we'll see another Babylon 5 game, but there's a lot of things that seem to be coming back that maybe in a lot of different areas that I didn't think would ever come back. So I mean, there's always a market for retro something, but Babylon 5 to me is one of those, and again, this isn't just because I didn't like it when I was a kid. It feels a lot more niche. And a lot more, oddly, because I mean, it isn't that much different than other sci-fi shows that are popular, but I mean, when you're trying to really make a name in a world dominated by Star Trek and Star Wars as the massive sci-fi franchises, this show doesn't seem to be much of a blip on the radar for anybody born after the year 2000, and even some of us that were born in the 80s, we were too young to understand the significance of it, and why have two when I already have Star Trek?
Yeah, it's the mythos. I mean, there are very few things out there that have maintained a sci-fi space mythos. There was Earth AD. There was, I'm trying to think of all the different space things. Battlestar Galactica obviously has maintained.
Well, it came back in it, but it changed itself quite a bit. And would Babylon 5... Number one, I haven't seen that much of it, but would Babylon 5 need to change its format? Because, I don't know, Battlestar Galactica is kind of unique in that, especially in the reimagining, where it's essentially just the two races. Yeah. You have the Cylons and the humans, and they battle. It's just constantly chasing through space.
And it took the nostalgia effect, but...
A little bit. Most of the people that enjoyed the original did not like the new one. That seems to be the opinion. Now, I've gone back and tried to watch the original, and it's way too cheesy and hokey for me.
It was. And I'm of the generation that watched the original, and I actually liked the new one. Didn't bother me. But I
thought the new one was great.
You know, because of the fact that I like anime and the idea of different universes and storylines with the exact same characters, you know, and there being differences between the two, that has never bothered me.
Well, and that's an idea that is really making its headway in with Star Trek right now with the Kelvin timeline and the multiverse idea, which has always been talked about, but never so prominent, I don't believe, never so present as it is now, where different people want to take their own view. I mean, you expect it from like DC comic book movies, but you don't necessarily expect it from. But now with like the new Star Trek show coming out, we're seeing a whole lot of different imaginings, if you will. But I mean, Babylon 5 was more dramatic at its core than what I consider some of the Star Trek stuff. I think Babylon 5, watching it now, I feel like it was a little bit, it's somewhere between Star Trek and the new Battlestar Galactica. Yeah. Where you kind of have the pristine, clean science fiction utopia of Star Trek and what Roddenberry envisioned. That was very clean, everything is in its place. I mean, crap happens because that's the way you have to make television, but it's very clean. It's kind of like...
almost utopic.
The bridge on the Nostromo in Aliens is like white with bright lights. I mean, that's all. It's very clean. I mean, the rest of the ship sucks, but and then Battlestar Galactica, the 2005 plus era, was gritty and dirty and dark and broken and old. Babylon 5 kind of feels somewhere in the middle there because it's not like Deep Space Nine, which is a recognized Starfleet space station. I guess it was Starfleet. Or Federation space station is probably the better phrase.
Something along those lines. I'm certain Star Trek fans
there were I'm sure I'll get chewed out for that, but there were Starfleet officers present on it, or Starfleet
essentially they seem to have manned personnel. The vast majority of the...
Right. But it wasn't like that, where that is a established station that the history of the Babylon Project was rife with bad luck. And so nobody expected it to ever do anything. They didn't expect it to even last. I mean, the Babylon 4 finished and then was gone within 24 hours. And it was just missing. People saw a bright light and that was it. And so you can read the history of the book. Roleplaying Game and Factbook contains the history of the Babylon Project and the bad luck that just befell every station up to Babylon 5. So it's kind of, are we going to survive? As you know, the people that are there are essentially taking their lives into their hands. I mean, we can look at that as earthbound humans and say, well, anybody going to space takes their life into their hands. But no, these people are in a society and in a culture where they are spacefaring. They're going out there and interacting with other races and doing exploratory things and diplomatic things with other races and they have this place that they don't know if they're going to survive just because they're out somewhere where people just generally don't go.
Yeah, no, there are very few series that I really feel captured what Babylon 5 did, where they had that space trucker mentality where, you know, it was almost like a gas station where all these cargo ships and everything else were coming through on their way to someplace else constantly. Right. And so, it was a very big spacefaring world.
Right.
And I do wonder about, you know, the continuation of it. There is, I forgot to mention this earlier, Mongoose actually did put out a series of modules for it for travel. And so that is another universe that you can actually run Traveler in.
You know, I just feel like the way that the show is laid out, what I've seen of it, it makes it a great role-playing setting. There is, being on a space station, it's not like just your ship with just your human crew or, you know, your singular race. You have all all these races to choose from, all these classes. You have people traveling through. You have an endless amount of encounters that you can create. It's not just like a static location.
And because of that, it also definitely falls in the role play idea, because Babylon 5 wasn't about massive combat and shootouts.
Right.
It was about the interactions. And I think that also is what makes it such a great game.
Mm-hmm. But also, if you got shot, you died.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very deadly, and that they even, which I will say, I've seen a lot of D20 books, I've seen a lot of role-playing books that tend to think that their combat is more deadly than the other guys.
Yeah.
But that is a line that they specifically point out in this, is that combat in this is extraordinarily deadly, more so than any other D&D or D20 game that you have played otherwise. I don't know if that's true or not. That's something that we will maybe someday take a look at, but...
well, I think it's an excellent segue for what's going to be our next episode.
We're at least going to, we're going to at least create a character. I don't know if we'll run anything, but...
yeah.
But yeah, we'll take, even though it does seem character creation seems pretty straightforward. I mean, it seems like standard D20 character creation is just different names for stuff.
Yeah, but it's one of those things. So we're going to go ahead and we'll be doing another episode where we will actually crack open the books and make some characters. And I think what it comes down to for me when I do character creation is, will this game do what it's set out to do? And that is, do you feel like when you make that character, when you're done, do you feel like this is a character that could have been on that show or could have taken place in that? Does the game set out to do does it accomplish what it set out to do? Mm-hmm. And so that's pretty much what I think we'll do for our next episode. We are John and Roxy from Passion Nerdly, and you can listen to us and some more of the podcasts that we currently are on at Nerds Domain. Thank you all so much.
This has been a production of the Southgate Media Group. For more podcasts like this one, head over to southgatemediagroup.com.